Hello, humans. Who have we got in the live? Please say hi. Tell me where you're watching from. Glad to see folks turning out. I see a few people turning up. Love to see some comments from you. Where are you watching from today, and how's it going there in your version of the lockdown or whatever state of COVID you're in your neck of the woods? So while I wait for some folks to respond, just so that you know, in case you are tuning in for the first time, this is the Tech Humanist Show, and it is a multimedia format program. That means we're doing this as a live stream, and it will be available across all the different channels that you can watch live streams, pretty much. And then it'll stay archived on YouTube. And then there'll be an audio podcast available at a certain point. So typically, I have those available the Friday after. So we do these Thursday afternoon. Tomorrow, last Thursday's audio podcast will be available. So I look forward to sharing that with you. I am trying to see your comments, and for some reason, they are not showing up. There we are. Okay. Tony says hi from Germany. Hi, Tony Menzel. Nice to see you tuning in. Bill Butler says, Bill from Nashville. It's swampy hot here. Sorry to hear that, Bill. Glad you're here. I don't know why my camera keeps flipping out. There we go. Now we're getting everything all set up. Everything is well. All right, we got Tony. We got Bill. I know there's a few more of you on the line. So feel free to comment in. Get your questions ready. I'm going to tell you about our guest, and that'll get you ready to ask the questions that you have to ask. So please feel free to subscribe or follow wherever you're watching, and you'll always have access to the coming shows. Oh, wait, we have one more. Hi, watching from Switzerland, checking for Dorothea. Yeah, you're going to love it. All right, Chris Bueller, thanks for being here. All right, so today we are talking with Dorothea Baur, a leading expert and advisor in Europe on ethics, responsibility, and sustainability across industries such as finance, technology, and beyond. Her PhD is in NGO-business partnerships, which is really interesting, and she's been active in research and projects across sustainable investment, corporate social responsibility, and increasingly emerging technologies such as AI. So she's been developing an audit system for contact tracing against the background of COVID-19 as a ForHumanity Fellow. So we'll talk a little bit about that too. She's founder and owner of Baur Consulting AG. Among her many distinctions, she's been named as one of the 100 brilliant women in AI ethics. So start getting those questions ready for our guest. And there we go. Dorothea, you are live on the Tech Humanist Show. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm so glad you're here. I know that we have so much ground to cover because you're doing so much. Someone referred to you as a Wonder Woman on Twitter this morning.
Which is kind of totally exaggerated, and I think she was more referring to herself. She would be the appropriate one to carry that label.
I think she actually clarified that she definitely was not talking about herself. But some of our listeners may not be as familiar with some of the acronyms and terms that we talked about. So I wanted to just orient people in some of the areas of work that you do. So corporate social responsibility, CSR, talk us through a little bit about what that entails and what some of the practices are in that.
Yeah, corporate social responsibility is like one of the most used acronyms that actually describes all extra financial obligations and responsibilities of corporations. So it's not just social, actually, it also covers environmental responsibilities. You could also call it corporate sustainability or corporate responsibility. There are tons of terms that are used for the same thing. But it's important to know that this is basically what companies mostly take on voluntarily, what they commit themselves to, but it's not pure philanthropy. Okay. So, for example, they might want to give more transparency on their supply chain that is legally mandated, or they go beyond the minimum legal standards in some countries where the standards are very low, etc. So all of these like non-directly financial aspects of corporate activities can be summarized by corporate social responsibility.
Okay, that's really helpful. I'm sure that that'll help our watchers and listeners have useful questions to ask. And then we talked also about ESG, so environmental, social, and governance investing. So help us understand what that term refers to.
Yeah, ESG is basically the CSR of the financial industry. So it's a term that investors use to talk about non-financial aspects of their investments. So when nowadays BlackRock says we are promoting ESG investments, that means they don't just judge their investments based on expected return on investment, but they also take into account environmental and social and governance factors when they invest. So ESG is the buzzword among the financial community, and CSR is like the old term, like mostly for the business ethics aspects of all corporations across industry.
Now, I know you're also doing a lot around AI ethics and tech ethics too. Are you finding that these areas are starting to intersect more and more?
They do. I think sometimes, both can learn from each other also, especially because, CSR, so my background is in business ethics, it's very theoretical, but so the whole questions about legitimate business models, legitimate ways of making money, legitimate ways of distributing profit, ethical ways of, treating your stakeholders, or unethical ways. All these issues have been thoroughly discussed by the CSR community, or in the business ethics context, on a more theoretical or more practical level, depending on what you look at. And so a lot of these questions are kind of history repeating when it comes to the tech sector. Tech sector has some distinctive, ethical challenges that have never been seen before, such as the speed and the intransparency of machine learning, etc. So that's distinctively new. But all those things about, is this an okay way of doing money? Is this an okay way of treating our employees, our stakeholders, and gig workers, etc.? Those are questions that have been, discussed, but of course not resolved by the CSR community. But at least, I think these two fields can really benefit from each other.
Is it also the scale and the velocity of AI and tech that changes that conversation?
Yeah, and it's also, it's not just technically a black box. I mean, machine learning and algorithms are not just really a black box in a technical sense. It's also kind of deterring non-engineers to take a closer look, because you feel like deterred by the whole jargon around it, which is needed. Of course, it's a technical vocabulary. We cannot expect engineers to talk about, whatever soap bubble stuff just to make it feel tangible or visible for us. But still, I think it's a double black box. It's a black box in the real technical sense of the word, that you don't know what's being the input and the output, or how the two relate. But it's also a black box, like, there's not much we can say about that. It's machines processing something, whereas other industries, it's more like, there's a mining company, they have these and these mines with this kind of people working there, suffering from these problems and causing so and so much emissions. It's much more tangible in other industries. So I think that makes AI a bit evasive for us.
And, there's this whole concept of AI for good and tech for good. That's really kind of a hot topic, or a trending hashtag at least, right? What do you make of those ideas as it applies to the work you see and do?
Yeah, I know that in my bubble, I think I move in a bubble, online, etc. There's a lot of cynicism about these terms, but I think there is something genuinely good to be gained from AI and from tech for good. That's more than just ethics washing, my favorite pet peeve. And I really think that AI has huge potential to cause good, especially when it comes to environmental sustainability. So, for example, the whole problem of pattern recognition in machine learning, where you feel like when it's applied to humans, it is, full of biases, and it kind of confuses correlation and causation, and it is violating privacy, etc. There are a lot of issues that you don't have when you use the same kind of technology in a natural science context, where you just observe patterns of oceans and clouds and whatever, or when you try to control the extinction of species. I mean, animals don't have a need for or a right to privacy. So, why not use AI in contexts where it really, doesn't violate anyone's moral rights? I think there are enough use cases, and where you at the same time resolve a real problem. Those two are conditions for me for tech for good.
Yeah, that's a really good distinction. And I talked with Yale's Forestry and Sustainability program last year, and I felt like that was a lot of the discussion there too, is that there's so much data to be harnessed about naturally occurring phenomena and be able to impact human life on the other side of that process, as opposed to tracking humans.
Justified.
Right.
Where the emissions are justified, not just for some nonsense algorithm, whatever, predicting something you don't really want to know and overriding my rights, etc. And so I think there's plenty of stuff to do. The problem is, of course, how to make money of it. Of course, I mean, you can't just talk about the AI for good without thinking about the monetary aspects.
Well, and you're a uniquely qualified person to talk about that. So it does kind of come full circle, right? So you want to be able to have this CSR and ESG in the corporate space. And then the AI for good and tech for good discussion sort of emerges out of wanting that to scale and wanting all the proposals to scale. But then you have to bring it back around into this holistic CSR ESG model, right? So how do you reconcile all of that? How do you bring those into a holistic framework that actually makes sense?
Well, it's not about reconciling. It's about being able to just tolerate the tension.
That's a great way to put it.
It's not always win-win, and it's not triple win, as some people would say. Like environment, society, and a business, they all win at once. Often it's about trade-offs. But of course, I think if you can make money with ESG and if you can make money with CSR, that's totally legitimate. That's great for you. Do it. But please also do it if you earn less money with it and if it does not pay off immediately anymore. So don't make your ethics dependent on the business case. But I mean, if you find a business case for ethics, go for it.
Yeah.
There's nothing bad about making money. I'm not talking about maximizing profit and making yourself a billionaire and giving your shareholders, I don't know what kind of dividends and totally losing all kind of relation to the real problems in the world. But it's not bad in itself to make money. But so when it's hard. Some business models are probably inherently more ethical and others are inherently less ethical or totally unethical. I mean, you can't bring, in my opinion, it's a dangerous field. What am I saying here? I'm live. It's hard to bring ethics to a nuclear arms company.
It's hard to bring ethics to certain areas, right? Yeah. I think you can maybe dodge that a little bit if you'd like, but I want to give you an out.
Thanks.
Which it feels like what you're really saying is that there are, or if I'm interpreting correctly, that there are some approaches which are closer to solving real human problems, right?
Exactly.
And they're closer to the human experience. They're closer to what genuine human needs are. And then there are other things that go wildly awry, or far afield of that.
Because sorry.
No, I was just gonna say most things are in the middle somehow. It seems like, right?
Yes. They are, and then you need to shift. Then you need to take some decisions, and you need to make trade-offs. But ideally, I'm the one pushing for trade-offs in favor of ethics, of course, without losing sight of the business reality.
Yeah.
And so what I think is in AI ethics. Wait, I just lost what I wanted to say. That's very smart.
That's okay.
So
we'll come back to it if you like.
Onset dementia. I'll remember.
All right. One of the things that struck me as I was looking over some notes and thinking about our conversation was the more I read up and kind of refreshed my thinking on ESG and CSR and kind of the evolution of those fields, the more it struck me that those fields evolved out of concern for labor, right, and for workers' collectives and labor power. And then, of course, when you start thinking about the emergence of AI and tech-driven capacity, it's an entirely different equation. So I wondered if you would be able to speak to how do you, maybe it's another case of just tolerating the tension, as you said earlier, but how do you kind of make sense of the ESG and CSR models and their concern with labor and workers when we're looking at a completely different model of scale and capacity?
I think it's the type of human factor that we're looking at changes, and so the difference is if you look at heavily industrialized context like heavy manufacturing or like textile industry and all those tangible goods that are being produced, of course the rights we talk about are first like the human rights of labor, health and safety, etc. So, but I mean, trade unions have come out of fashion a while ago now. What I could observe from also all those sustainability reports, a lot of companies don't really like to talk about trade unions anymore. They talk about human rights, etc. But the unionization is has lost a bit. Unfortunately, has lost a bit of momentum. So and so when we switch to AI, you think, oh, you're in the service industry, it's not labor intensive, etc. But the human factor is still there. Maybe not mainly as certainly not the blue collar employee, at least not within the owned operations of tech companies. And maybe also not as many white collar employees in relation to their turnover as in other contexts. But there are a lot of people linked to tech companies or to AI. First of all, often invisible, we have those ghost workers that they're called, the whole, gig economy, or like people doing a very low paid work of tagging pictures to train data sets, etc. And so there is a labor issue, a classical one. In fact,
content moderation or the mechanical Turk sort of thing.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, that's really a straightforward human rights case there. They're just not so visible. And you think, it's a pure service industry. It's only like, servers and, one human taking care of 100 servers, etc. But there are a lot more people linked in the supply chain, you could say, and also, moreover, affected by the technology, So in textile, I'm not that affected by, the clothes I'm wearing should not be toxic on my skin, and that's it, But so the AI I'm using can violate my privacy. It can, the AI that is used on me, it can discriminate me. It can make it impossible for me to get a mortgage, etc. So it's more the users or like the customers or the users, you say, that are in the focus, but it's still very much about humans. And at the same time, even though we think like, it's all like, just electricity, etc., there's also sustainability, like the emission part of AI that I always like to emphasize. There's also an environmental dimension.
And not to mention, so I think it's a really important point about, you said the ghost workers and the many people who are involved in bringing scale to things that are dependent on, sort of a gig economy infrastructure, but also the communities that are impacted. And that feels like it brings it right back around to the sustainability and the environmental discussion.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Out of places where, let's say, minerals are harvested for chips or things like that. So that must be part of the discussion at some level as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, of course. I mean, the whole supply chain of the IT industry is also, heavily based on minerals. And there are really interesting initiatives also by tech companies or like commodity companies that specifically focus on the minerals or the metals that are in our computers, like on cobalt. There is a new transparency initiative, a fair cobalt initiative that I just read about. So they are aware of this. But if you look at where's the main focus, it's more on the output than on the input. It's more like we call it like downstream than upstream, but of course, I mean that's a huge issue, like the rare earth discussion, etc. Where you get those
emissions from. Right? That would be emissions as well. It would seem like
emissions. I mean, honestly, it's when I read like how many emissions GPT-3 must have generated, the training, the energy that we used for training GPT-3, and I don't want to downplay GPT-3, and I'm fascinated by what it is capable of, but I'm not sure yet how long it takes until GPT-3 will save any human life. And
right.
It's also, the same about Bitcoin and all these, technologies that don't directly contribute to the real economy, and they use up so much energy. And even though the tech companies say, we're going to be carbon neutral or even carbon negative, as long as they, sell their cloud services to the fossil industry. That's basically irrelevant. So, there's this hypocrisy, and they say we're going to plant trees the size of, I don't know, Kazakhstan, and good luck with that.
Yeah, you just made me write a little note to remind myself to look into carbon offsetting this show. It's definitely some emissions.
I'll help you.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Well, then, so offsetting seems like it must be an enormous part of the discussion in many parts of the industry. So corporate partnerships and foundations, they must be investing in carbon offsetting and other projects, and that feels like it's really needed. That's an easy piece in some ways, but I would imagine there may also be areas of concern there.
Yeah, because offsetting is a really good thing. It's good to know that there are ways to kind of undo or like reduce, compensate for the carbon, for the emissions you generate. And but the first question to ask should not be, can I offset it, or how can I offset it? But it should be is what I'm doing, is it even necessary? So, let's say my favorite passion is to fly to Barcelona every other weekend just for fun, for party. Mm-hmm. So instead of offsetting it, maybe I should stop doing it. And the same for companies. I said, the tech companies saying we're going to be carbon negative, but they make most money from totally unsustainable industries by selling their services to unsustainable industries. That's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
And it's also controversial, what I always joke about, the amount of trees that have been promised to be planted.
Right.
I can't imagine. I'm waiting for the day when I look out of my window in the middle of the city and they start planting trees, because so many trees have been promised. I think like the whole planet must be covered with trees. And the thing is, it takes decades until the tree you plant really turns into a carbon sink. So all that planting trees, and then also saying like, oh, we're going to bring solar cookers to people in Africa. It's also, a bit latently colonialist attitude. So, we make it possible for you to cook in a clean way, but we dictate it to you. And so
do you think
it's not that easy.
Do you think the tree planting discourse is really shorthand, though? It's an easy way to convey or do you think it's a promise that's just never going to be delivered on?
It sounds nice, but I think there's some double accounting sometimes.
Yeah.
That certain trees are counted twice, and it's easy to get the credit for planting a tree, but it's hard to verify the reduction you achieve because it takes such a long time.
Right.
And so there are all these issues. So I think it's also interesting. EasyJet, for example, says, oh, we're going to offset our emissions. And then you see they calculate, I think, $4 per ton of carbon that they emit to compensate.
Okay.
But Microsoft calculates $15 per ton that they emit. So you can imagine the difference that you can make with $4 per ton or $15 per ton. That's huge.
That's an enormous difference.
Yeah. So
I imagine EasyJet is generating more than a few tons of carbon.
Yeah, well, recently they have slowed down a bit.
Yeah, right. As we all have. You made me very wistful when you talked about going to Barcelona for a party.
Well, we all have our dark sides.
Yeah. I want to switch gears for just a moment and ask you about the contact tracing project. Speaking of the impact that COVID-19 has had on our lives in terms of keeping us from travel and things like that. How has that project been to try to put some audit? I think you're working on auditing the process of contact tracing, or what is it exactly?
It's a great initiative. It's by this not-for-profit organization called ForHumanity that is led by Ryan Carrier, a guy from East Coast, near New York.
Okay.
And he has launched this organization and this whole project, and we're still working on it heavily. It's not it's not done yet. So on Monday, I think we're going to release 2,000 lines of code.
Right.
So it's an audit system. Contact tracing, not just the digital one, but also the analog one, the making phone calls, etc. And it covers basically 5 silos that we call silos. So it covers aspects related to of course, to privacy, but also to bias, to cybersecurity, and to ethics. And so ethics, privacy, trust, bias, cybersecurity. So those 5 silos. And some questions are really technical, how is the data stored and what kind of protocol are you using, and questions that I don't really understand because I'm not a tech person, not an engineer. But there is also a lot of, as I said, one silo is trust, like how is it enforced, how transparent is it, is this contact tracing system that you're using, is it authorized by a public authority? Is it automatically downloaded? So these are all ethically relevant questions, So once we have that ready, that audit system, we can basically, implement it with authorities that use contact tracing, and they, like an audit system, they can say, oh yeah, we can certify that only these people have access to the data, or that the data is only stored in an aggregate manner, etc. And so working on this has made me even more aware of the complexity of contact tracing. And I'm so in my Swiss ivory tower, where everything is like democratic and and directly democratic. So I was only aware like how many different facets of contact tracing systems there are, and what could be, what is possible with contact tracing when I joined that group. So we are now, I don't know how many people we are working with, but we're still looking for more people, and everyone can join. It's it's open for everyone to join. And it's a really great initiative. So really,
we'll try to include that URL in the show notes. Is it just forhumanity.org or something like that?
Yeah, I would have to look it up. But
okay, all right, I'll look it up. I'll be sure. So I would imagine that there's some tech challenges, and you talked through some of those, and there's some human challenges, right? Like I think on some level it feels like whenever this conversation comes up about contact tracing, everyone knows that, or I shouldn't say everyone knows, a lot of people understand that is a key managing the pandemic. Yet it feels as if there's an awful lot of suspicion or doubt about how that data is going to be used and how safe it is to participate in these programs. So what have you learned about the tech challenges versus the human challenges, and how do we overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, I've learned that to relate, but I cannot really answer the technical questions. It's more about accuracy there. So how much should the distance be between people, etc., for the signal to work, and what is acceptable, false positive rate, etc. Well, that's also an ethical question, of course, because you don't want to be notified every other day that you should quarantine yourself,
right?
Unjustifiably. So, but also interoperability. What happens? That what we have in Europe now. What happens if you go to another country? So Switzerland is not part of the EU. So we're not part of the interoperability network that the EU has set up, because we don't have this agreement with them. So our app does not work in Germany, etc. So, but that's a price we pay for being stubbornly independent, in quotes. So, and so all the technical questions, but also the human challenges, like how do you ensure trust? What makes for a trustworthy system? And one thing is, of course, technology. But what I can see in Switzerland, and probably also in the US, you have these decentralized versions, where it is clear that it is only stored on the gadgets, and that the authorities don't have access to it's without location tracking, etc. And even though we have the most privacy preserving technology that's possible, people still have heavy distrust, and it's not even the distrust that you might expect, because we know that the whole decentralized technology depends on Google and Apple. It's not just a distrust towards tech companies, but it's just a general unease. And then sometimes I wonder, but these are just my thoughts, whether people just don't want to face the consequences of having the app on their phones. Because, it's more interesting. The question is, what happens if you get notified? Is the quarantine enforced? Is someone going to look whether you're really staying indoors? Are you going to be compensated for the loss in your wage while you're at home? If you're a white-collar worker, you might continue to do your job at home. That's the case in Switzerland, where you get paid. And if you're a blue-collar worker, you're going to lose your money. So it's also creating very unequal incentives and moral hazards for different kinds of people. And I think, I know you have a degree in German, I think it's a Stellvertreter-Diskurs, the thing about privacy. I'm sure you understand me.
Yeah. I'm not sure our listeners do, but some of them. I know we have some German viewers on right now.
Yeah, we have some, but I mean, the Stellvertreter-Diskurs is like a maneuver distraction. It's not really hitting the point, It's not really about privacy. It's more about, am I willing to bear the consequences of my actions, and not just am I willing, am I also able to, because maybe I'm not able to protect myself from being exposed to the virus because I have to use public transport, etc., and I have duties, and then am I financially able to lock myself in and maybe not earn money, etc. So I think the privacy is just the lowest hanging fruit to focus on.
Yeah.
But there's a lot more behind that. And it's really challenging for the solidarity in all our communities, I think. It's a solidarity challenge.
Yeah, such a fair set of questions to surface. And does it also bring you into, have you begun to have any discussions through ForHumanity or any of the work that you're doing around some of the proposed ideas around sort of immunity passports or theoretical ideas about what might happen as a next stage beyond these contact tracing apps?
Yeah, I have followed those debates a bit. We haven't really discussed it in the context of ForHumanity yet, or not as far as I know. But it's just the immunity passports. Again, it's this continuation or replication of, structural injustice. Mm-hmm. It's always along the same dividing lines in society, kind of.
Yeah.
And it will, those who are more vulnerable and more dependent will be more heavily affected and pay a higher price for not being immune or be forced to expose themselves as soon as they are immune, even though we don't know yet for how long immunity lasts, etc. So, if you have plenty of space and money, you are better off in times of corona because you can keep a distance from other people and you can, buy yourself out of the pandemic, basically, somehow. And that's, I think, so the same with contact tracing, very different implications for different people, immunity passports, and there's no quick technological fix. And also what I observe, you can have the best technology in the world, the best privacy preserving technology, and you can have the most democratic authorities in the world, as we have in Switzerland. If these authorities are not up to date with technology know-how, that's the case in Switzerland, where they use fax machines, where they prefer fax machines over digital tools.
Right.
You cannot use that technology in that totally analog context. So there needs to be a cultural fit for the technology to your authorities and the people who use the technology.
It's like those governments are working with my landlord who insists on me faxing documents. I don't know how to fax.
I recently I got a CD for an X-ray. Like, what am I doing with the CD? Sorry, why not the tape? Tape recorder.
It's such a weird time. Yeah, it's really a weird time because not only of the pandemic, but we've been in the midst of this multi-year digital transformation. I mean, digital transformation has been a hot topic for so long anyway, but it feels like we were kind of in the throes of a big push, and now it's a much bigger push. But what really strikes me about your perspective and your background is that you're in this very interesting position to be able to think systemically across a lot of different dimensions, and not many people have that perspective.
No, it's nice. I take it as a compliment, but it's sometimes hard to frame. So it's always great to have a chance to really talk about these issues in depth and how they relate, in my opinion, because these are, they're connected, and even contact tracing, it all, it touches on, or the pandemic touches on a whole question of welfare state and social security, etc., and it's all kind of connected. So I really appreciate that chance.
Yeah, it's been a theme of my work for the last couple of years that everything is connected, and nothing has proven it more than this pandemic. But But I think even looking at your work, it's even more clear. Like when you talk about things like, ghost workers and the local economies, when you talk about, who's impacted across different types of earners and people who are in different sort of class stratifications in society. And you have so many different lenses through which to look at this with a lot of credibility. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to ask you is a question that I like to ask some guests now and then is when you think about technologies, and we talked about tech for good and AI for good and all this, but when you think about the technologies that you see on the horizon that you see being developed and that are emerging, which ones of them strike you potentially as good for humanity, as a boost to humanity?
I'm really excited about technological developments in healthcare. So and also again fascinating from an ethical perspective is that if you talk about precision medicine, you get the right treatment based on all your specific characteristics, and with the help of AI, this can be patterns can be evaluated better. So there it's like a reverting of the ethical problem. It's like it's a context where you want to be discriminated. Please discriminate me. I want you to take into account all my characteristics. I want you to know how many veggie burgers I eat. I want you to know how much I sleep, whatever I do, all my risk factors, etc. Because if this helps getting me to get the right treatment, I'm willing to lay it bare. So I think precision medicine is going to be a really great area, but also in medicine we can read that, and I think that's true. I mean, that machine learning can help identify candidates for vaccines much faster. Of course, always needs to be safe and reliable, and that's a problem of the black box and the intransparency sometimes. But so all of healthcare, and as I stated before, in sustainability, for example, I know recently, it's a bit quirky, but I like that stuff. I read about a challenge where coders were asked to develop I call it facial recognition for snakes.
Oh yeah.
It's not just the face of snakes, but the goal was to develop an app that you could take a picture when you get bitten by a snake. You take a picture, and then the snake is automatically identified. So when you get to the hospital, you can say, this type of snake has bitten me, because it's very important to identify the snake correctly to give you the right anti-venom. So, and this is so fascinating. Why waste our money and our emissions on facial recognition on people? I don't want to be recognized, please. But that snake doesn't care whether it is recognized. It has to be recognized even, and that's where you can use this machine learning for good. So all these, there are so many fascinating areas where you don't run into these ethical problems.
Yeah. It also strikes me that you're talking less about recognition in an identity sort of sense as you're talking about recognition in a pattern recognition sort of sense, right?
Exactly.
So it's not important that it's snake Jane Doe versus snake John Doe.
It's not about blaming the snake. We're not going to blame you. There might be a false positive, but it has no consequences for the snake.
There's no
it has
culpability for the snake.
Yes,
yeah. No, that's a really interesting premise, and also the precision healthcare seems like such an exciting idea, because it does seem like there's, at least when I think about American healthcare, and of course, we're one of the most screwed up systems in the world in terms of the inequity of it, and we have so much richness in the system, and it's so unavailable to so many. But that potential seems like it could start to right some of that potentially, right? Like you could be able to integrate what you know from one specialist and what you know from another specialist, and no one ever has time or the capacity to bring to a doctor and say, here are all the things that are going on with me across this different health system and this different health system, because you can't get doctors to talk to one another.
No, I think that's, I always rant about democratizing AI, because I find it a misuse of the term democracy, because I'm a political scientist by training. So, because it's such as like, what is it? Is it going to be participatory AI or self-legislating AI? But what people mean when they talk about democratizing AI is meaning that they make it accessible to people. And I think in healthcare, AI, it's not about democratizing AI, it's about democratizing healthcare. Because, if you have some reliable programs that can, do a radiologist's work partially, not fully substitute him or her, but it means that it is much easier available for more people. So it lowers access barriers if you have this technology at scale. And of course, again, there will be unfairness because some people will be able to still afford a human doctor. So people will say, oh, can you still afford a human doctor? So no, sorry, I have to take the AI. Of course, it will never be entirely fair. But I think it is okay to talk about democratization for once. I accept it for once.
Okay. But you're being very specific about what it is that's being democratized.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
That's a really important distinction too. And you also touched on something that reminded me of, you recently tweeted about this notion of participation washing, right? And the notion that you can't have participatory AI if what you're really talking about is, people that are clicking on reCAPTCHA images that are stop signs, and that's just training AI. You're distributing the work across a lot of random people and their human experience, but it's not really making the AI any more democratized. It's not making that process any more true participation.
And it's like the ideal that I'm adhering to, like the human in the loop. I mean, these people, they are very human, but they're not humans in the loop.
Right.
Because, it's not like they really have a human impact, and they're degraded to doing work, and they're kept probably separately from each other. So they will never unionize, and they will never raise against their bosses. So, I mean, it's a very dehumanizing way of having humans in the loop.
Yeah, it's like, I guess, adjacent to the loop or under the loop or something something like that. Yeah. Do you generally think about technology as empowering humanity, overcoming it, or threatening it, or some other relationship between humanity and technology?
I think it's all at once. Well, maybe least of all, overcoming. I don't see like the AI overlord knocking on our door anytime soon. I'm not transhumanist. I'm a fervently humanist. I just finished reading Harari's Homo Deus, and it took me a couple of weeks, but
it takes a while.
Wow, humanist is a term he uses critically, and I'm proud to be a humanist, and the negative term would be anthropocentrist, like putting the human in the center and disregarding all non-human entities. But I can only think from my own species perspective, and I can still care about animals, etc. But I'm humanist. I believe that there is something distinctive about humans that we need to keep alive, and so this is our responsibility that we have as humans. And so but it is empowering, of course, because it connects us. It makes like technology. It connects all of us. It makes information accessible. It kind of on so many ways, the democratization aspect is real. Mm-hmm. So it is empowering. It is threatening, of course, because if technology, the whole fake news and the deep fakes, etc., that's really threatening. Also, immediately in the context of upcoming elections, and even in democratic big countries, and so it is threatening in many ways, and overcoming it is the least, I'd say. So, but it has always been that, I mean, nuclear weapons, nuclear power has already threatened us. So, yeah.
I love what you said about the sort of being a proud humanist, because I feel like it's funny to me, since I am vegan. I've been vegan for 22 years, so I am very much concerned with animal welfare. I want there to be concern for all living things, absolutely. But I do agree with you. I completely think that there's something special about humanity, and as a human, that may be a biased perspective, but I think that it makes sense in the context of human creation of technology to protect that which is human as we develop technology, right?
Well, I mean, first of all, being a humanist doesn't mean that you cannot or should not be vegetarian or vegan. Right. I mean, I'm like 95% vegetarian or 99% vegetarian. So one is like you call it epistemological perspective, like what can you know? I can only know what humans know and what humans feel. I cannot certainly know what animals feel. I have a lot of indications that they don't like to suffer. They probably don't want to be killed and kept in, in stables, etc. And so that's why I don't eat them. I'll still eat their cheese, etc. But that's from an epistemological restriction that I have as a human. And the other thing is, do I think they have rights? And I think they do have rights. So in that way, I'm not a humanist. But So what we need to. So I think one of the biggest achievements is that 240 years ago, when the Enlightenment set in, that movement, that philosophical movement in Europe by Immanuel Kant, etc., where he said, hey, people, dare to use your own mind. It was like a wake-up call, because until then we have been caught as, the slaves of God. I'm sorry, I don't want to, offend anyone, but we didn't really make an effort to explore the world, because we thought everything was determined by God. So by stepping out of this dependency and using our own brains, we liberated ourselves from the shackles of religion or other authorities. And so now, are we just, taking it too far? Have we used our brains so far that we're eventually creating machines that are smarter than us, and they're kind of imposing their decisions again upon us, and not just imposing their decisions upon us, but also imposing decisions that are about equally intransparent as God's decision, if you look at certain algorithms.
Right.
So what is this like? Are we reverting? Are we going back into places of darkness? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to frame that. That it takes the human agency out of the framework.
Exactly,
right?
Yeah, and I think it's a duty. We cannot delegate our responsibility to machines. We can use machines to improve our, health and our well-being, etc., to improve the world. But we cannot entirely delegate responsibility to machines, especially not if we don't fully understand them, and if we cannot revert or intervene at any point in time. So,
when you think about humanity and the human condition and what it means to be human, what do you feel like is the most uniquely human trait, or what do you kind of come back to when you think about humanity as the thing that really characterizes human experience or what it means to be human?
I know I'm totally out of fashion with that, but I'm a bit of a Kantian, so I think about free will and responsibility, the ability to take on responsibility and to kind of decide how we want to act, and then be held accountable for how we acted, which, the whole agency thing, which is also what sets us apart from animals. I can't hold a dog to account when he sits on the couch. I mean, he wouldn't understand why. So and as Hans Jonas, like a German U.S. philosopher, said, something like, by having this responsibility, we need to keep this responsibility alive, and we must never extinguish the human species, because extinguishing the human species would mean to extinguish responsibility from this world. Because when humanity is gone, or if we eradicate us, he wrote that in light of the nuclear threats, in the 70s, etc., where suddenly you had the potential to erase all of humanity with a few nuclear bombs, or like a significant part. He said that's not okay. We need to preserve our species, because we are the only ones who are capable of responsibility, and this gives us the responsibility to keep ourselves alive, or like preserve ourselves. And I really liked Jonas in that regard, even though he's considered very Luddite or like anti-tech, and yeah.
That's okay. We've had people who describe themselves as tech abolitionists on this show.
Oh,
so.
okay. So I'm relatively mild.
Yeah, you're being
moderate.
Right in line.
Okay. Not in line. I'm moderate.
Moderate. We'll go with that. When you think about how tech plays into scaling the possible futures for humanity, I think, the way I think about it, and I just want to frame this up, is that there are ways that we could build toward the best futures for all of humanity, and there are ways that we could build toward the worst futures for all of humanity. And of course, I feel like, we're always doing a little bit of both. And I hope that we're always trying to aim for the good side. But what we have to characterize what it is, what that means, right? How do we steer toward the best futures with tech? So in your mind, how do you think, or what do you think we can do in culture and in business, in organizations, to stand a better chance of bringing about the best futures with tech for humanity?
I think we have a great chance again by connecting the dots. So after a long, debate, etc., the United Nations have finally established those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which is kind of a global consensus, and that's not just about CO2 emissions, but that covers a wide range of goals that are desirable under the headline "Leave No One Behind." So democratizing, leave no one behind, but in the real sense of the word, basically. And so, why not subject AI or technological development to those standards also? If we have a globally acknowledged framework, of course, with flaws and trade-offs, etc. But instead of reinventing the wheel and saying like, what kind of future do we want, and then what can technology do in that future, like. Oh, we have already a vision of the future we want, or what we have to avoid and what we want to achieve with these SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Why not integrate the whole tech discussion into this framework and maybe add some tech-specific challenges that I mentioned? Not everything fits under these Sustainable Development Goals, but that's what I mean. Don't reinvent the wheel. I mean, tech is just a means to an end, and if the end is Sustainable Development Goal, Sustainable Development, make tech a means to achieve this end and measure it based on how it contributes to achieving those goals.
That makes sense. And I talk about that myself on a regular basis, about using the SDGs as a roadmap for development and bringing AI and emerging technology discussions in alignment with that roadmap. And what's interesting to me about that too is that it gives plenty of commercializable opportunities. You talked earlier about you can't just have this conversation in a vacuum, not acknowledging that corporations want to make money, and there's no reason why there isn't an incentive to make money. There's plenty of incentive within those SDGs when technology is applied to them or outside of technology applications to make money. In alignment with outcomes. I see synergies, but I also see red flags. But it's also that sometimes you think like, oh, technology, like deep fakes. You couldn't say they violate the Sustainable Development Goals. So you cannot answer all the questions about tech with the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, the question about deep fakes, it's another question. It's just a purely ethical question. It's just, I say AI for nonsense or AI for bad or tech for evil, however you want to call it. And that's an entirely separate discussion that we also need to lead. But a lot of it can be aligned or like judged based on the contribution of the Sustainable Development Goals. I think you just coined the hashtag AI for nonsense.
Happy to.
What if companies, if people are watching and they're representatives of corporations or organizations and they want to take actionable steps to bring their work better in line? You mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals. So are there other actionable steps or kind of guidelines that you can recommend for organizations and individuals to bring their work in line with these principles?
I mean, there's a like overwhelming amount of voluntary standards, industry specific or regional standards, etc. It really depends on where your business is located and what you do, etc. But I think very important is always talking about participation, participatory machine learning. Take your stakeholders on board, see who is affected by your business, and take them on board, have a discussion, take your critics on board, don't corrupt them, take them on board, listen to them. and so those multi-stakeholder approaches, I know they have their own risks of inequality and structural injustice, etc. But you're certainly doing better by talking to your stakeholders than by not talking. So stakeholder approaches.
Right. Yeah. It's come up a few times on this show that we've talked about, the development of technologies or of solutions without involving communities that are going to be affected by those solutions is a completely silly and wrong-headed approach. But and you're right that sometimes involving those communities can actually lead to problematic work as well. but it's got to be better in general. It's got to be the better approach. So that's great. Invite your stakeholders and invite the communities that are affected. That's wonderful. Also, Chris Buehler coined the hashtag here, AI for nonsense invented by Dorothea Baur. So there you go.
Thanks. Wow, AI invented nonsense.
I mean, I feel like that's almost the Twitter character limit right there. So just all we can ever tweet is just that hashtag. Where can people find your work if they want to follow along? I'm sure that you've got a lot of new fans after this show. So where can they track you?
Well, I'm mostly active on Twitter, as you know. That's where I kind of spend too much time, you could say, but where I also gain a lot by being up to date all the time with the debates. Twitter, LinkedIn. I have a website that's in urgent need of revision. You can look at it, but don't judge me based on my website, please.
And that's baurconsulting.ch, is that right?
Yeah, that would be one, but don't repeat it. Just it's easy to find me on social media. I need to revise it, but yeah.
Fair enough. I always figure it's the cobbler's kids, that make the worst shoes or whatever, that don't have shoes. That's the whole thing. That's
totally
me.
Undermining my credibility.
No, I get it. It's totally where I'm at too. Okay. Dorothea, thanks so much for being on the show. I know there were a lot of comments that I didn't read aloud. It was a lot of people just going, yay, yay. They were so excited to have you on. Great. So thank you for being here. It's a really wonderful conversation. I really appreciate what you're doing out there to bring together these different types of conversations and these different holistic views and make sure that corporate discussions and organizational discussions are all happening in alignment with one another. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a real pleasure to talk to you. Thanks.
You too. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.